do think it's fair to say that when race is a topic of discussion, there is always discomfort. It's definitely a multi-sensory experience. And I would say that the aim of these webinars is to eventually like move through that discomfort and use that energy productively to produce change, and definitely not to instill shame or blame. For me, a commitment to anti-racist practice is just not an issue of morality, is it? A good person versus bad person. It's really, really about acknowledging systems that disadvantage and other people. And it's about recognizing the part we play in that. And I spoke a little bit about that in the first webinar. I was really pleased to hear from some of you last time after the webinar, sharing that you could use the attendance at the webinar as a discussion point for team meetings, and even to talk about race in supervision for the first time. And that is great. And I want to tell you that sort of moving forward in the webinars, we will be joined by a number of speakers and experts who can further help us to do this with vigor, I think, just through sharing their tools and models. We have Professor Tedham in the audience today listening, and some of you would have heard me refer to her 4Ds, 2Ps model, which is an anti-racist model, which hopefully she'll share with us in a future webinar. So I'm very excited about that. And I think today's webinar, we're about to experience decolonialism and an opportunity to sort of unlearn some inaccurate histories, because I've heard Abu-Bakr speak before, question our ingrained thoughts, habits, stereotypes, knowledge. What is truth? What do we know to be true? And how true is that? And I think that should really sort of lead us towards acquiring new knowledge and enable us to practice different ways of engaging with the people that we walk alongside from all different backgrounds. So I guess what I'm really passionate about is sort of learning from the past to inform our future. So just want to quickly do the kind of self-care announcement, which is very, very important. So if at any point anybody wants to leave the space, please do that, but do reach out to someone. Join back if you can, and if you can't, that's okay too, but please look after yourself. We will be recording the session and we'll open up at the end to take reflections, questions. We really appreciate your participation. And throughout the session, please feel free to use the chat function and share your thoughts. So without any further delay, I would like to introduce and hand over to our presenter for the next hour, Abu-Bakr. An absolute privilege to have you here with us today, Abu-Bakr. In the invite, I shared a little bit about you, and many colleagues asked, is he a psychologist? Is he a historian? And my response was, he is both, and he is much, much more. Yes. So please, Abu-Bakr, start by sharing with us how many hats you actually wear, and actually how they connect in making you the expert historian that you are. So over to you, Abu-Bakr, and thank you so much for visiting us in Camden today.
Okay, Shabnab, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate your turnout. This is the third session I have done as a training session in the last probably two and a half months with Camden Council, etc. So it's clear that I'm hitting the note with the right departments. Let me just tell you a little bit about myself before I dive into my presentation. I'm a historian, basically self-taught. I had the opportunity to meet my grandmother. My grandmother was born in the late 1800s, and probably the only person maybe on this forum, on this platform, which can actually claim that. Most of your grandparents would have been born in the early 1900s, etc. And as a young boy, being a West Indian as she was, she was a light-skinned woman who came over here. She taught me that she was a slave. So this concept that Britain had actually ended slavery in Jamaica, for instance, was a misnomer to a large extent, because a lot of the poor people, whether they were mulattoes or light skin or dark skin, were still enslaved to a certain point. So this is what I really got my teachings from. I would listen to her stories attentively. And even though she was a woman which couldn't read or write, this is where my interest began. When I started growing up, I noticed the African Caribbean community, a lot of them assimilated, like my parents, for instance. Most of my grandparents assimilated because they believed that Britain was the mother country and everything in Britain was good. So there was a large amount of assimilation with many of the West Indians, as they were called at that time. And the reason why I got into things later is because I can see that the history of my people, especially in Wales, being lost. And a lot of the things that I experienced, like racial segregation in the early 70s, because I know that as a black child, I was not allowed to try on clothes in the shop. We had to buy them and take them home. Yeah, this was the reality of Britain that I grew up in. Same with my grandparents and my parents. We weren't allowed to try on anything. We weren't even allowed to go to grocery stores and touch the fruits and vegetables, even though the grocer, the greengrocer, was able to spit on the apples and rub it in his shirt. That was the reality of Britain that we lived in. So my training, basically, I went as a mature student because I left school, barely read and write, etc. A very precocious child. By the time I was 16, went into the educational system into secondary school. I was deliberately put into the remedial class, didn't learn anything for those 5 years, and I ended up becoming like a teacher's assistant to help those remedial students. So I was basically used. And it was years later, I ended up wanting to get back into education because I had difficulties with literacy and numeracy. I did my university course and I wanted to specialize in as much social disciplines as possible, first and foremost to help my people, but also to help the wider community because it was deficiencies and defects within their bringing, within their own development. I felt I can help and I wanted to help. So that's just a little introduction with me. I work for Caerphilly County Borough Council as a special education needs tutor. So I deal with students. I'm also a counsellor. I'm also an education consultant for the Welsh Government. And one of the things I'm leading now is trying to make a multicultural curriculum in the Welsh curriculum by 2022. So I'm helping the Welsh Government see how they can try to amalgamate the historical legacies of Black and African people, as well as a multicultural curriculum as well. We need our Mediterranean groups of people in this country, our Asiatic groups of people, our Middle Eastern people to be reflected in the curriculum as well. So without further ado, let me make a start. So the training outline will look at these 5 factors here. So we're going to look at the history of racism in ancient and modern societies. And I think this is important. And the reason why it's important is because racism within the Western or the British context is only about 400 to 450 years old. It's not that old. Okay, I think this is important for us to know. We're also going to look at white supremacy and white superiority, because that was a term which was coined by white people themselves. So I know a lot of white people get offended when they hear about white supremacy, but that was a statement or a phrase or a terminology that they themselves coined in the so-called New World. We're also going to look at the construction of race and how that came about. We're also going to look at institutional as well as systemic racism. And at the end, if we got enough time, or this may come up in the question and answer period, we're going to look at healing, solutions, and answers. Because there's no point me delivering a presentation unless I can give you some sort of solutions or resolves to some of these social maladies that we actually go through. So one of the things which I like to ask people, but unfortunately the answers come up. I didn't actually make it zoom in on my own account. How many races are there on the planet? A lot of people think it's 3. Some people go as far as saying it's 23. Some say 5, etc., etc. But with modern science today, as a result of genetics and DNA, there's only one race, and that's the human race. And that is what it is, because race was constructed to be a physical and a biological specification. And a result of that specification, whites, especially in the New World, started to construct an idea that those who were lighter skinned were superior and the others were inferior. So what happened before the 1400s? Who were the superior races at that time? This was never really uttered within Europe, because the main empires or civilizations before the 1400s was what? We knew the Moors were in Spain, the African and the Arabs were in Spain for 781 years. And they brought science, technology, philosophy, and all these other things. We know that the Asiatics were very powerful as well in southern India, in China, and all those other places. So to construct race based on superiority and inferiority, it had to come when Europeans went out and started conquering land. 100 or 200 years before that, they were really the 5th nation. If you look at the First World, Second World, they were more or less the 5th and 6th world at that particular time. So race is a social construct, which is based upon the physical and biological specifications, where superiority and inferiority over certain races come. And that was constructed round about the 1600s. Here's a particular image which is found in the tombs of Ramses III. And there were three distinctive races of the ancient Kemites, which we now call the Egyptians. The Egyptians call themselves Kemites. The word Kemites comes from a Hamitic word which means black, the black lands. So they used an adjective to describe themselves. It doesn't mean the black soil, as white Egyptologists are trying to make us believe. Because if you look here, you've got a person sat here. They're talking about a black person. That is not soil. That's a person. So Kemet, Kemitu, okay, which is a singular for an individual. This is what they call themselves. A is the ancient Egyptians, how they saw themselves, okay, at this time. This was after the time of Moses, peace be unto him. Then B shows the Indo-European type. If you look at the Indo-European, you can still see the Africoid sort of nose, but you can also see their light skin. You can also see they are mixed, okay? That's a mixture. That's how the Indo-Europeans appeared at that time. Then you look at C, these are Nubians and the rest of Africans. So the Egyptians, they had no problems of identifying themselves with Africans because that's who they were. This is what they were saying. Although Egyptologists have gone in and tried to falsify and deceive people in who they actually were. And then D are the Semitic groups. And if you look at D, you can see that they are a mixture as well. So not fully white. So there's an admixture which is taking place. But the thing is what I want to emphasize here, in the ancient world, there was three races or distinctive groups which is understood by the high cultures and civilizations at that time. Now let's look at certain social divisions within society. When we look at social divisions, we're always looking at aspects of inequalities and stratifications. Inequalities is the unfair distribution of wealth and resources, particular groups of people. And stratifications is the level or the status that a person is within society. Stratification comes from a geological term or word, which means strata or means layers. So you have people who are up the top and people at the bottom. It's part of a hierarchical structural system. And those things have always existed throughout time. It existed with tribes and clans and particular groups. Now it's ethnicities and races. It's based upon class and all these other type of things. So in the modern aspect, when we're looking at the social divisions, one of the things that we need to isolate and understand is that these are the 5 distinctive social divisions that take place in British society. There's class distinctions. If you go onto airplanes as an example, or you go on trains, they still got first class cabins or areas. So that element of classism is intrinsically ingrained within British society, within the British mentality. Gender stratifications, inequalities, even though women have made it a large amount within the employment sector or the labor market, there's still elements of discrimination taking place. Hello? Okay, so what has happened with the gender issues as well? Those gender inequalities, stratifications still exist, even though we have seen a large amount of women enter the workforce on a full-time basis, especially in the last 20 to 25 years. Sexuality, age, but my focus today is going to look at race because unfortunately in the last 10 to 15 years within many of the employment sectors, in many of the companies, the private companies, corporate companies, and even the public sectors, race as a form of training has been attenuated or reduced or eradicated from the programs. And there's a reason for this because of the uncomfortability that comes when we discuss race within a particular sphere or within a particular social space. And that's the reason why. And why is it all of a sudden people are talking about race now? We have these moments within British history that there's only a particular window we're allowed to talk about race. So race was first allowed to talk about after the 1960s and all these other type of eras where all these race relation acts were passed. The first time that the government really wanted to talk about race after 1965 was in 1981 when the Scarman report was done after the Brixton riots because of the amount of inequalities and stratifications that the inner city black communities were going through. Okay, and that identified and highlighted the form of discriminatory practices that the labour market, housing, and the police force was engaged in within his inner city communities. And then what happened? The report was done. Then all of a sudden, racism was supposed to have ended. And then all of a sudden, we get the Stephen Lauren case and we get the Macpherson report in the early 2000s. And now we can talk about race again. And he basically mentioned the aspect of institutional racism, not just namely in the police force, but also that diffused within particular industries within the labour market. And one of the things that the Macpherson report highlighted about the police corruption was that there were three aspects of racism, corruption, and incompetence that took place with those police with the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. So what I'm trying to say to you is that race within British society has its window, and this has always been the case. When this window is going to close and we're going to go on to something else, and then people are going to say that racism is end, I don't know. But the things need to change. We're going back and we're repeating the things of the 1950s and 60s, which means very little has changed. Here is Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall was head of the department. He was one of the first black professors who was given a department in Birmingham University. And he was from Jamaica. He came over, I'm not sure, I think it was Oxford that he studied in, and he was a social scientist, a sociologist by training. And he headed cultural studies program. This man single-handedly, he had transformed cultural studies in British society, so much so that he influenced cultural studies in the United States of America. This Jamaican man. However, when he got the post, there was many white professors and many white doctors and senior lecturers who was going to work under this man. They felt very uncomfortable. And this is probably one of the problems now with systemic and institutional racism within the private sector and the corporate world, where a lot of middle class, predominantly white people who's never had a black teacher, never had black people in their neighborhood, never come from a black community, and never had a black friend, feel very uncomfortable. Sometimes not their fault. Other times, some of them know exactly what they're doing. But the reality of this situation is that we're seeing this element of stratification and inequalities taking place within the workplace. And what this man had gone through, he had transformed. So he was given a job. Maybe he was given a job to set up to fail. And this man revolutionized cultural studies within Britain. And even though he used his light skin privilege, because when we talk about white supremacy, what we have to understand, it diffuses down to a large extent that when people are very much lighter, they have more aspects of achieving things within their community, within their society. And this man didn't forget where he came from. And what I'm trying to emphasize here, he uses light skin privilege, and he didn't make race a sideline. He dealt with race head on. And he made sure that the BBC and the ITV would air some of these things. And he was a person who was really against a lot of the reforms during the Thatcher era. So what he basically says that race is a floating signifier. And what he means by that is race takes different forms in different times. All of a sudden, we're talking about institutional racism, systemic racism, cultural racism. Where did all these things come from? Where did all these terms come from? It goes through a series of events. And what happens if you look even further, this is what takes place. If you look at race at the center, what Stuart Hall is saying, it takes different forms depending on the different criteria which are being used to assess, to evaluate particular groups of people at particular times. So for instance, there was elements of race discrimination within religion, and I will look at the two religions which were based upon that. Then philosophy had a hand in trying to interpret race as a specific classification based upon the physical and biological specifications. And we look at science that had a major role. Then we're going to look at the social, historical, and cultural. We look at the sociology, history, and anthropology, which all had some way of shaping race, where lighter skinned people became the superior, darker skinned people became inferior. Race is a social construct. It's a floating signifier. It is based upon made up assumptions in order to legitimize a particular group within society to maintain hegemony over the resources, minerals, commodities, as well as the land. This is what it's about. As well as that, in order to preserve their group from so-called contamination from other groups. They don't want their group to be tainted. It's about holding on to power. Hegemony is about power, control, and authority, not just over the lives of people and the minds of people and the hearts of people. Even what they consume has to be owned by a particular group of people. And this is what race is about. So in 1969, they basically turned around and said that race was a mental disorder. This is something which has been bypassed to a large extent, but it was established in 1969 that race was a mental disorder. A specific nature of the destructiveness of racism was set forth by the caucus of Black psychiatrists at 1969 annual meeting of the American Psychiatric Association in Miami, Florida. The Black Caucus stated that racism was not only the #1 mental health problem in this nation, but additionally was the #1 cause of all mental health problems. So racism, according to this, which has been backed up to a large extent by the American Psychiatric Association, which is a predominantly all-white association. Because you have to understand, if you know American history, that all these associations and societies were segregated. So when you look at the Black Caucus Psychiatric Association, they were born during segregation. It was not a case that they called themselves that. They called themselves that because they were not allowed to become part of the American Psychiatric Association. You can find this quotation with Frances Cress Welsing, who did a lot of work looking at racism and white supremacy and its psychological effects on dark-skinned people, more or less children. That's who she worked with, mainly with children. And what makes it a mental illness is these 5 characteristics where Dr. Asa Hilliard, who was a psychologist, an African-American psychologist, said there were 5 basic principles to establish that racism was a mental disorder. A denial of reality, to deny that racism even exists when it's there in our face. Because it may not attract or absorb into our 5 senses, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. There are many people within Western society who believe if it doesn't affect me, if I don't see it and hear it, it doesn't exist. This is totally unfair. So just because I'm a person who's a male and a woman talks about chauvinism and all these other type of things that she may experience, because I don't experience it, do I actually deny or reject those claims? I can't do that. That is her experience. And experiences should be taken into account. We cannot allow a dominant culture within society to determine the reality of other people. This is wrong, and this is totally unfair. The other one is perceptual distortion. We see things and then we distort. It's not really like that. Why are you taking it so personal? I didn't mean it in this way. Okay, this is a person who has cultural incompetence to a large extent because they don't know the narrative of the experience of what that person went through by the statement, phrase, or terminology which was used at that particular time. So we become very defensive when we say things. We should sometimes put our hands up and we should learn. We should all acknowledge that we're all here to learn. Delusions of grandeur, which means I feel I'm better than the other person, that person have nothing to offer me, and then blaming the victim. So these are the aspects which causes racism to be defined as a mental disorder. This is just an example of what a mental disorder looks like. So here you got the 4 policemen in the early 1990s beaten to almost to death this individual, Rodney King. The trial went to court. The 4 officers, an all-white jury, 4 officers got off with it as if they were not guilty. Denial of reality. Everyone saw the footage. Perceptual distortion. They didn't really do that. Maybe he should have stopped. Maybe shouldn't have resisted arrest. This is a perceptual distortion. Phobia, feeling different. I felt my life was threatened. Okay, you can see these things coming up. Why they say it's a mental disorder. Okay, so these are just some of the things I want to show you, that there's this element of desensitization that comes from those people from the dominant culture when atrocities take place on people of color. Here, you can see a person being lynched. And the reason why I got this, because there's 2 things or 3 things in this image which needs to be identified. First thing, if you look carefully, you can see this is handcuffs. So this is clear to show you this lynching, police or law enforcement are involved. directly involved with vigilante groups, which means this is state-sanctioned terrorism. This is what this is proves. And also you got three little white girls there. You can see their faces. You look at their faces carefully, and obviously it's an older woman. There's no sign of disgust, upset, pain, empathy, nothing at all. This is what happens. Now, let me just give you an example. Supposing these girls decide they want to go into the legal system as judges, barristers, lawyers, attorneys, whatever the case may be. What type of mindset are they going to have for the legal system if a dark person is put in the dock? Let's think about these type of things, because this is where a lot of the people from police forces were put into these strategic positions, within the labor market, the employment sector. This is important. And there you've got a dark-skinned woman walking away, couldn't even look at it. Okay? These were made into postcards. And what they're finding out in many of the places in America is that they're finding black genitals, whether the vaginas and penises. Sorry for being graphic, but this is true. A lot of students find this in attics and basements, where they would cut up these bodies during these lynchings. Sometimes these lynchings would have 2,000 to 3,000 people. They were staged in the sense of just kidnapping somebody, torturing them for hours. They would have meals and food. This is the medieval mentality that the British brought over to North America, because this is exactly the same thing. If we read the times of the Tudor period, the Stuart period, this is what was happening. This is part of British culture, which became Americanized and legitimized in their country. Then you can see this. This is a mental disorder. This man thinks he's not doing anything. Okay, there's nothing that's going to happen to me. Delusions of grandeur. Okay, you can see this image. This woman here, you can see, is basically a passerby. I think she even had children. This is during the riots, etc., where because she's a black woman, we're just going to grab her anyway. Took it away from her children, apparently. Okay, and arrested her. She was just a passerby. There you look in South Africa. This was the Sharpeville massacre in the 1960s, where you see policemen, okay, people who are supposed to honor and protect, beating people for protesting against the racist system within South Africa, which I must tell you that Britain supported. Britain supported. And yet, what is upsetting about this, the apartheid in South Africa did not come after the Second World War. And what they did, you mean to tell me that Britain and America fought against so-called fascism or racism amongst white people? That's what the war was really about in the Second World War. And South Africa was allowed to adopt Nazi-style rhetoric and systematize it, and they supported. This is hypocrisy. You can't fight a nation for implementing this. And because it's implemented on white people or black people, you're going to support that system. Even Nelson Mandela himself was called a terrorist. And then you've got in Indiana, state of Indiana, where you find, this is after the church service, okay? They're all dressed up, etc. Picnics, you see lights in the background. All this is staged in the sense that this was set up for weeks. If you read the article to this, they were waiting for other trains to come in. Yeah, churches, pastors and bishops, etc., would let the congregation out early because the lynch. So it was state terrorism. Every institution was involved. This is a malady in a system. And a lot of these things was in the Caribbean islands. And a lot of this mentality is here in the UK. So what I'm trying to show you, denial of reality, perceptual distortion, phobia in the face of differences, delusions of grandeur, and blaming the victim. This is a thing. And all of these constitute racism being a mental illness. Now we're going to look at race and religion. So when we look at race and religion, when we look at forms of discriminatory practices, etc., it first started to emerge within the Jewish and the Christian faiths. It's in the Genesis, which is in the Old Testament, looking at the so-called curse of Ham, whereby there was three distinctive races: Japhetic, which is the Indo-Europeans; Ham is the father of the black race; and Shem is the father of the Semitic groups, where he was supposed to look at the nakedness of his father, Noah. But if you read the Bible carefully, it says, "Cursed be Canaan," not "Cursed be Ham." And over time, decided to put it on Ham. Okay, because Canaan, who was one of the descendants of Ham, of the black race, is Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria. That was called Canaan or Canaan. Okay, this is where they settled when they moved out of Africa. So the reality here is that religion now, as a floating race, as a floating signifier that Stuart Hall talks about, is going to make its contribution to racial stereotypes, racial labelings, and racial inferiority of particular groups. It goes on to say, there's a quotations there, racist theorists are satisfied with advancing the erroneous notions that Ham's punishment for the sins against Noah was to be turned black. So what they're saying, that if the interpretation was that he was white, and because he was naughty, he became black. So black became a curse. This is what was going. And if you understand the history of slavery or enslavement in the Caribbean islands, this is what they taught my people. Okay, you were here as slaves because of what you did in the past, etc. You were white people to begin with, and God cursed you with dark skin. Even if you look at the works of Benjamin Rush, I think his name is Benjamin Rush, and Samuel Cartwright, who were the earliest psychiatric practitioners in the United States of America. There was a concept known as negritude. Negritude meant that the black skin was what? It was a form of leprosy. And if white people came into close proximity with dark-skinned people, that dark skin would be transferred onto them. This is what was believed. This is what was believed in the latter part of the 1700s, throughout the 1800s, into the 20th century. I even know this because when I was an individual going to school, I remember the white teacher licking her fingers, putting on my face to see if it would come off. That's the mentality of the people at the time. Now we're going to look at another place where racism as a system really begins in ancient times. Because what we have within Britain or Western society is only really 400 years old. So here's Mohenjo-Daro. Mohenjo-Daro was an ancient civilization which was created by Dravidians. Okay, these are Afro-Asiatic groups. This is long before the Indo-European groups came in. And this was obviously in Pakistan. And this is the excavation which they found in the latter part of the 1800s under the British Raj. There you can see with excavations that these people, these dark-skinned people, these Sri Lankan, dark-skinned Indian people, this is what they created. A sewage system and bath water drain inside the house. They even had running water inside the house. And this is approximately 2500 BC. We're talking over 4,000 years ago. This is what these people had created. And then something happened in order to remove them from the centers of power. And there's Harappan civilization, which is in the Punjab region. So this is very much like ancient, like you've heard of ancient Sumerian and Babylon, and ancient Egypt and ancient Nubia, ancient Kush and all these places. What is usually missing from ancient civilization is what these dark-skinned people, who are now known as social pariahs within South India or within Asia, okay, is now being pushed to one side and slowly trying to be attributed to people who weren't even there. This is what's happening. So we're now seeing a falsification of history. So let's have a look. So when they came in, Indo-Europeans, because remember, if you go back in ancient times, etc., lighter skinned or darker skinned people were in the Caucasus areas. This is where they were, Indo-Europeans. And then a diffusion, a movement came, where lighter skinned people started to come into places like India, which we now know as Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. They went over into China. They went down into Iraq, Babylon, etc., came into Egypt. This is how the mixing and the lighter skinned populations came in. And this happened between 150 BC to 700 BC. So we know which people lived in the equator for maybe 30, 40, 60,000 years, depending if you're looking at paleontological datings or genetic datings. This is how long the dark-skinned people were living in these particular regions. And this diffusion of movement of people came in, and then they start to change the social dynamics of that particular system. So what happened is this caste system, which we know today, was established in this area here, which is now in modern day Pakistan, etc. At the time, it was called by the Aryans. That's what they called themselves, which means the nobles. Okay, Aryavata, the land of the nobles. That's what it was called. And then it started to diffuse into other areas. So when we look at the likes of Hindustan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, these are all cousins. They all come out of Central Asia and diffused into the equator. This is how this all came about, producing this race mixing and lighter skinned population. But a system was developed in order to maintain the status quo of the new invaders. So when the Aryans came in, they called the system Varna. Varna means color. It's the skin color of the people, the original people, the Dravidian populations. And then once they decided to stratify them based upon color, they allocated to them particular jobs, roles within the labor market. And obviously the darker skinned people got the worst end of the deal. So the caste system can be defined as a system dividing all of Hindu society. I don't like to call it Hinduism. I'd rather call it Brahminism, because there are many Hindus who do not subscribe to this system. I have to make that thing clear. They don't. And there are many, many light-skinned Indians, as well as Asians in general, because it flourishes in places like Pakistan and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and all these other places. Okay, that system flourishes in those places. Even some places in Indochina has got the same system. That's how it diffused out. So the emphasis here is to show that not every person who follows that religion subscribes to that system. It also goes on to say all the Hindu society into endogamous groups. Endogamy is a term which means you marry from one another. You trade with one another. So for instance, if you're Pashtun or Pathan or whatever the case may be, you could only marry from that group. That's what endogamy means. If you marry out, it means exogamy, to marry out. So you got interracial marriage, yeah? You got marriage, interracial marriage. That's what it's about. Exogamy is interracial marriage. Two people from two different races, so-called, coming together, and miscegenation is the children they produce from this bond or union. Now, within the so-called caste system, because they call it caste, which means the level you're at, but the system was actually called Varna, is about skin color. Varna, not Jete. So the reality is now that the three things that came out of this system, because remember, like I said, race is socially constructed. Okay, it's socially constructed. It's not from the divine. It's socially constructed. It's also separation regarding marriage and contract. So they couldn't marry from outside that particular group. Division of labor. So it's not just in marriage contracts now. It's actually in the workplace that this system goes. And that's what I mean. It's a system. It's a global system. Okay, division of labor of each group representing certain professions. So you're only relegated to a certain profession because of your skin color or what they now call caste. And the hierarchy, which ranks the groups on a scale, dividing them into high and low castes. Okay, and this is how it goes. This is a caste system. I'm not going to read through it. They're the Brahmins at the top, the Kshatriyas and the Vaishyas. And they respond by wearing particular dots on their head. The white dot for the Brahmins, the Aryan elites, or the white class, all these were the white Aryans that came in, okay? And they stratify themselves into three different groups or types. And at the bottom, you can see with the Sudras, okay, who wore the black dot, and then later on you had the outcasts, or the untouchables, or the scheduled castes, as the British Raj understood the caste system when they were documenting how things were. So the Sudras are the commoners, they're the peasants, they're the servants. So this is just to give you an example of what has taken place in India. Some people say the system is 6,000 years old. The system is probably 4,000 to 5,000 years old. So they talk about the Manu codes, okay? They were saying things within the Manu codes that the shadows of the Dalits, okay, the broken people, or the Sudras was polluted. So you weren't supposed to walk behind them. They had to wear caps around their heads, okay, to catch the saliva from their mouth, because the saliva was considered polluting. And if a Brahmin or someone from a higher caste walked, they were polluted. And the list just goes on and on as you can read. So you can see how these people, they like to call themselves Dalits, which is a Hebrew word, which means broken or to break. They are broken people. And it's still part of the legal system, political system, the social system, the economic system. And this is what we have to understand about racism, prejudice, and discrimination. It permeates and pervades in every social aspect of life. which means it's going to affect everybody, whether they're the victims or the perpetrators on both sides of the fence. So we're going to look at philosophy and race. So when we look at philosophy and race, philosophy begins around about the 1750s, around about the time of industrialization, the Industrial Revolution. Obviously, the Industrial Revolution only came about because of the slave trade. Okay, if you read Adam Smith's book of The Wealth of Nations, it is clear it is slavery that created industrialization in Britain. This is a fact. This is where they got the revenue from. This is where they got the raw materials from in order to so-called industrialize. So at that time when industrialization was emerging in Britain, we started to see the Enlightenment come round about the same time. And what was happening was that all types of terms and phrases and terminologies were being used. And Charles Montesquieu is believed to be one of the fathers of the Enlightenment period, the 1700s. This is what he has to say about people. And according to most of the records that I come across, he never even seen a black person and never even went to Africa, didn't even see them properly. Is stories he is hearing of planters and visitors to the Caribbean or to North America, what they're bringing back to Europe. That is what he's reporting on. This is not eyewitness accounts. And this is what you'll find when you look at the racialization within philosophy, that many of the groups of people that have their say philosophically on race issues, it is conjecture, is hearsay, is what the planters themselves were saying to maybe justify to themselves that what they were doing was okay. He turns around and says that these creatures are all over black and with such a flat nose that they can scarcely be pitied. In other words, they all look the same. This is what he's saying. It is harder to believe that God, who is a wise being, should place a soul, especially a good soul, in a black, ugly body. So now you see the emergence of black being associated with ugly. White is wonderful, black is ugly, etc. Now you see how this starts to permeate in Western societies now during the Enlightenment period. So when Stuart Hall talks about race being a floating signifier, this is what I looked at religion, your race being in religion as a signifier. The next one now is philosophy. Then we have the likes of David Hume, is considered the father of philosophy in Scotland, the Scottish Enlightenment period, David Hume. And this is what he has to say about what's happening, because you've got to realize that Scotland at the time was importing thousands upon thousands of tons of tobacco, okay, coming out of North America. That's what they were importing. And that's what created, major cities like Glasgow and Edinburgh, because of what was taking place, those cotton plantations, okay, was coming back to Scotland. So this is what he has to say. I am apt to suspect the Negroes to be naturally inferior to whites. There never was a civilized nation of any other complexion than white. I just talked about the ancient Egyptians, and I just talked about Mohenjo-Daro and Harappan civilization, which were created by dark-skinned people. So now you're going to see the slow falsification of people, where they have to go through what I call the 3 C's: classification, categorization, and characterization. This is my theory of bringing context to these type of developments. What I mean about classification, them versus us, that's separation. When it looks at racial, hold on a sec. Sorry about that. So when we're looking at the racial classification, so classification, categorization means we put people into particular categories. So they divide, we categorize them, and then we characterize them. We put personalities, characteristics about their behavior. This is what they start to do. And this is what they were doing. So they had to distance us from our civilizations, attributed to invaders or settlers or interlopers. And then in order to drive home our so-called inferiority. There never was a civilized nation of any other complexion than white, nor even any individual eminent, either of action or speculation. Action means behavior. Speculation means thoughts, logic, reason. This is what he's talking about. The dark-skinned people don't have this, okay? No ingenious manufacturers, among them, no arts, no sciences. And we know this is untrue. So you can slowly see the deceptive falsification that is taking place as Western society, culture, or hegemony is slowly developing after the 1500s. Then we have the likes of Carl von Linnaeus. Okay, he's a naturalist. He goes and says his little thing. I'm not going to read all through this, but I just want to focus on two. Look how he looks at Homo europaeus. Europaeus, Homo americus, Homo asiaticus, and Homo afra. Homo europaeanus is all white, fickle, sanguine, blue-eyed, gentle, and governed by law. Even though they were enslaving people, denying women the rights, indenturing white poor people to work alongside slaves from this country in the Americas as an indentured labor force, because we haven't even dealt with the white slave trade in this country. It's like Britain wants to put his head in the sand, you know, and we see the evidence of the white trade. If you look at North Africa, for instance, that's a prime example of the white slave trade that took place, where many of people were sent to places like North Africa. Women were sold, men were sold by Britain, by Italy, by France, by Germany, by Holland, by Austria, by Poland. All these countries, even they weren't formulated as countries at the time, and that came later, this is what they were doing. They were selling their own people. So it wasn't just dark-skinned people. But one thing I want to emphasize now is if you look at Homo Hafer, this is what he describes: phlegmatic, cunning. Why does he use cunning? Because at the time, black people were slaves, and because they were trying to rise up, you know, because of the brutal system of enslavement through slave insurrections and slave rebellions and slave resistance, that's what made them cunning. Because they wanted freedom, that's what made them cunning. Because slave work was hard, people like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, all these other people who were known as slave owners, okay, they never did no work. Okay, they didn't do no work. They call themselves planters and merchants. The work was done by darker skinned people, and the work is backbreaking. But because they didn't want to do the work, they want to refer to them as lazy. Then they want to say that we were lustful, because raping dark skinned women at that time was legal. If you can say they were lustful, we are not raping them. This is why he said lustful. Okay, we were used as breeding machines to produce the next strong generation of workers, laborers. We wasn't in the West to be educated. We were in the West to work to enrich the pockets of planters, men of profession, and merchants. This is what it was all about. And this is what created the system of capitalism. They talk about us being careless and governed by caprice, meaning we have capricious behavior, sudden change in our mood and behavior. You don't know where we're at with these so-called Negroes or these so-called slaves. This is what's happening now. So categorization, I've just gone through classification, categorization, and now characterization. This is the characterization, looking at our so-called personalities. And Blumenbach, which came much later, just round about the American Civil War, not sure if it's 1775 or 1776, he divides the races into 5, okay, based upon skin color, based upon geographical location. And this is when he introduces into the vocabulary Caucasian, okay, Caucasian. Before that, they were white. The word Caucasian came by Blumenbach around about 1776. And the word Caucasian has been used ever since then. So you can see the classification, the construction of race that has taken place from as early as the 1600s. This is the Treaty of Tordesillas after the Moors or the Muslims were kicked out of Spain and Portugal in 1492. What happened was Spain and Portugal, who were the 2 first European nation states, started fighting one another. And then later on, what starts to take place was that the Pope had intervened because the so-called explorations and discoveries was coming out of these 2 nations. So what he did, he divided the world into 2. He gave half the world to Portugal and half the world to Spain. So this is why, if you look at this equatorial line, what you'll notice here is that this line here, which was brought about in 1494 because of what Columbus' so-called discoveries had basically brought up. This part here, Brazil, is Portuguese speaking because Portugal was given Brazil, Africa, and Asia. The Portuguese within India and China and all those places as early as 1501. because of the sanction of the Pope. The Pope was the most powerfulest person in Europe. And then Spain was given all the other lands, the Caribbean islands, North America, South America, Alaska, Central America. This is why they're Spanish speaking today. So this is what happens, that Spain and Portugal are given two parts of the world divided. Okay, and this is what's going to change the dynamics now of European hegemony over the rest of the nations, which are yellow, brown, black, and red. How does the word race come into existence? Because 7 to 11 European nations are racing down the Atlantic to develop it using slaves. So race means competition. Okay, and what they had to do, they had to negotiate with each other to sell themselves these raw material, these raw goods, manufacturing goods. This is what they had to do, commodities and minerals and resources. They had to trade this with one another. So they had to stop fighting because they were killing each other on the North Atlantic. This is what they were doing. So what happened was, when they were racing down to develop, the word race in the English language then was put upon these 5 groups of people that then become stratified. These are the nations who were involved in slave trading in the 1500s, right through to the 1600s, who had to negotiate to sell these resources to one another. And then whites came up the top, yellow, red, brown, and black. Because what they noticed was the Europeans, especially the British, when they went to these countries, they started noticing that every time they went to these countries, the people were people of color. They went to North America, they were black and brown. South America, they were brown and yellow. They went to Asia, they were brown, they ranged from all colors, okay, from red, yellow, black, and brown. And the same in Indochina, China, etc. This is what they started noticing. And when they're impregnating women in these so-called new discovered lands, what white British people started to realize that the phenotype of this miscegenation, what I mean is that the facial features and the complexion resembled the other rather than them. And that's when they started to realize is that non-white people got dominant genes and dominant traits. And this is one of the reasons why when children are miscegenated, when they're mixed, they always attribute them to the other. So for instance, if it's a black...
Abu-Bakr, sorry,
Yes?
Abu-Bakr, so sorry to disturb you, Shabnam here. Just to let you know, it's coming up to 12:30, but I know that you've probably got more to cover. Should we say another 10 minutes?
Okay, another 10 minutes will be fine. No
you.
problem at all. So what happens here now, you will find that the construction of race is now being imposed upon children. So a mixed race child is considered the other. So it's always actually, so the child will become black, or they'll become yellow, Asiatic, or whatever the case may be, not British or Welsh or English, etc. And this is what happens as far as racial construction is concerned. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to look at the labor market now, and then we can finish off there, which will basically become more relevant to who you are as individuals or a group of people. Okay, so white supremacy. So we're going to look at this in this part now, white supremacy. We're going to look at structural and institutional racism in society and the workplace. And like I said, when we're looking at white supremacy is a system. It's global. It's not national or local. It's global. And we don't just find it in the Western world. We find it in Asia. It's all over the world, in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, etc. In Asia, Southeast Asia, etc. It's even in Africa. And that is how potent and strong this system is. So let's have a look at what white supremacy is and how it immerses itself within our society. Like I said, the term white supremacy was coined in America. It was actually coined after the American Civil War of 1865. So that's how old it is. So when you look at the Ku Klux Klan, who had basically synthesized and coined the term, the whole point was because of darker skinned people becoming their so-called social equals after the abolition of slavery, they didn't want to associate themselves with that. So this white group come together in order to try to preserve who they were, preserve their culture, preserve their way of life, but also more or less to preserve the poorer people from amongst them. This is what was important of this superiority complex in which they had instituted within their system. So like I said, the people who took it on more were the poor whites, because they were the ones who were sent out to fight during the American Civil War. And the image there, what I'm trying to show here is that this is the reality of racism within our society, whereby a lot of people from the dominant culture, and it all even happens in my culture as well, coming from an African Caribbean background, in which they like to put their head in the sand and think it's going to go away. It's not going to go away. It hasn't gone away. It's taken 4,000, 400 to 500 years to be brought into play. It's going to take even that to eradicate it. And that is the reality of the situation, because racism in the West never really existed. Even if you look at the records of darker skinned people in Britain at the Roman times, they lived amongst the Celtic people. There was no racial classification and all these other type of things. It is new. It is socially constructed. Let's have a look at what BAME means, because there's this misnomer that BAME means the other. This is not true. So for instance, if you look at BAME, because what you have to understand is if you go back to after the post-war period, every person that came as colonial subjects into this country referred to as black. Asians referred to as black, okay? Mediterraneans were referred to as black. South Europeans were referred to as black. Even Chinese were called black. And they didn't become non-black until the late 1980s, early 1990s. This is what started happening. Even Irish people, do you know that Irish people were still black up until the late 1980s? That was their classification in literature. Similar thing took place in America with the Jews and the Italians and the Irish. They weren't even considered white until around about the 1950s. So even amongst white people, they referred to other people as black because they were downtrodden, whatever the case may be. So when we look at BAME, there are 3 words or letters in this acronym. So we know what black is. But what I want to emphasize here, that black also means people of mixed race. They're never half white. They don't go into the white category. They put them fully into the black category. So so you got West Africans, South Africans, African Caribbeans, etc., etc. The Asians don't just look at the South Asians, but Southeast Asia as well. So we're looking at Pakistani, Indians, and Bangladeshis, but it also includes in the A, Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans. But the A only came in because it was known as BME. The A only came in the last 2 to 3 years, 2 to 3 years, probably even 4 years, if that. So that was a new introduction to the acronym. Then we have minority. Now, what a lot of people don't understand that the people who were the minority groups, who were the marginalized groups in British society, are white. Women became a minority in 1964. Okay, the gay liberation movement, okay, they became minorities by 1972. And then round about 1995, disabled people became minorities. And in the 2000s, special educational needs and mental health became minorities. But when you listen to BAME, you were made to believe that the people who are BAME are people of color. Okay, and this is not true. They're not all people of color. The people who regulate or are relegated to the minority status, a majority of them are whites. And the thing is, there's this notion going around that white people can't be ethnic groups, which means they don't know what ethnicity means if they really believe that. And ethnicity means a group of people who have a shared language, culture, etc., etc. So Welsh people are an ethnic group. Irish are an ethnic group. Scottish people are an ethnic group. So the thing here is that white people are ethnics. They are ethnics, not the other. Because an ethnic means people with a shared culture and history. And Welsh people have a shared culture and history. It's not the same as Irish. And Irish are not the same as the Scots. And the Scots are not the same as the Welsh. They're distinctive. This is why we got these 4 nations. So this is what is important when we look at BAME. BAME is not people of color. This is a game that many trainers are trying to get people to believe, that white people are not ethnic groups and white people are not minorities, when every single one of those in the minority section all became minorities after 1964. Let's have a look at how racism is viewed within society. These are 2 authors, one on the top author, She's British, and obviously the one at the bottom is American. And they're basically dealing with the type of pathologies that take place within the white community where there's this denial that racism ended. I don't want to talk about it. It's very uncomfortable. But if it's uncomfortable to hear, do you not think that it's uncomfortable for somebody to experience it, especially if it's on a daily basis, through, through their listening, through what they see, from what they smell, and whatever the case may be? So from the 1990s till recently, British whites believe racism in British society ended. This is repression. This is what they were doing, it ended. When did it end? I usually say to people, and I was usually saying to people, I used to ask them, if racism ended, give me the day, month, and year it ended, or is eradicated, and what day do we celebrate that every year? They couldn't tell me. This is a myth. Whites saw as the end of racism, this despicable behavior through actions and thoughts. And this is what's important here, because a lot of people thought racism ended because they weren't hearing the word nigger, wog, sambo, gollywog, black bastard, sooty, packy, coolies, chinks, mongrels, and jippo. Because they weren't hearing that, racism obviously must have ended. But they forgot that racial prejudice and racial discrimination was still in force. Because racism, prejudice, and discrimination have different meanings, but you can have racial prejudice and racial discrimination. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is important for people, not just only from the dominant culture, from all groups, to realize that we all have these problems. Even in our own countries back home, people are stratified on race. However, we want full integration in this country, but we don't speak about it, about those stratifications, inequalities in our own countries back home. And this is why I said that racism is global. It's not just national, it's global. And you will see that at the top of the economic ladder, the social system, lighter-skinned people, and at the bottom are darker-skinned people. And this is just to emphasize the importance of looking at the difference between prejudice is the aspect of prejudgment, to have preconceived ideas about the people without even experience anything with them. You've only heard about it or saw it through negative lenses, etc. Discrimination is an action, and racism manifests all that, which then becomes institutionalized. But when we're looking at institutional and systemic racism, how does your organization or company look, okay, in the corporate world? Does it look like this, where everyone is white at the top and darker at the bottom? Or is it more like this, how they want to preserve it? It's all white. And as the system changed in 20 years, how many darker skinned people are in senior management? This is what they refer to as hegemonic structures. Okay, hegemonic structures mean a system which is controlled in order to restrict or to exclude, which means to limit or to prohibit people from being. So this is restriction. This one is restriction. You only can go so far. Exclusion, you can't get in at all. This is how the corporate world and the private labor market is looking. Even in the public sectors, it's looking like this. We haven't done much in the way of changes since the 1950s. There has been some change, but very little change. And there's all these unfair practices that take place within the workplace, whereby people who are from the so-called people of color group or the Bain group, etc., they don't see upward mobility. They've been in the company 10, 15, 20 years. People who've only from the dominant culture are coming in, less qualifications, less experience, and all of a sudden they're in the boardroom making decisions. And the people who've been there, who got passion and things from these so-called people of color community or these melanated groups, are not in decision-making positions. And this is what is important here. Equality and diversity has to be seen through all stratas of life. Okay, where we're looking at this, and it has to be experienced by every member of society. These little pop-out sections that people like to say, well, Obama and Bill Cosby and Oprah Winfrey, these are exceptions. But even with those exceptions, lynchings and police brutality and discriminatory practices still exist. So we cannot use that as a barometer for success for a particular group of people, because there's a chosen few from that group. Because white women in the labor market, more than ever, does it mean that everything has been eradicated, sexual discrimination, sexual harassment, as those things eradicated? No. So why is it eradicated for someone else if it's not eradicated within your own social stratas, your own forms of social inequalities. We have to be fair and we have to be diverse and diffusive in understanding how the system works. And one thing I'm going to do, I could probably visit the slides later through question and answers, is that there's a concept called game theory. And what game theory is about having designers, advocates, players, and pawns. It's about puppets and puppeteers who control the system. So when we're looking at systemic racism, institutional racism, cultural racism, and all these other terminologies they like to talk about, the first thing, how it came about, was who are the designers? Who put it together? In other words, designers are the decision makers. The advocates are people who are put in strategic positions to maintain the status quo, to maintain that preservation, that no one can get in whatsoever, or they have limited access while they're in there. Okay, so you've got advocates, you've got players who play the system, who don't even realize what the system is. They don't know what's going on. They think everything's fair because we've got a few people of color or melanated people in that industry. Well, things must have changed. Things must be good. And obviously you've got the pawns, who are the victims, in which the designers are created to ensure that the status quo, the system that they limit or prohibit people from getting into, is preserved and stays in their hands. And this is what it's about. I'm going to leave it there now, open it for questions. I may be able to visit other slides at the same time and see what happens. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Abu-Bakr. Yeah, we booked until 1. Sorry. Am I echoing?
Yes, you were, but I don't know if you are now.
I just stopped talking. Okay, now I'm better now. Jamie, we've not got much time, Abu-Bakr, but I mean, I could listen to you for hours and hours, and I hope you'll share the slides with us so that we can send them round. But I guess any reflections from you, Jamie, immediately, and then we can open up.
Just so incredibly powerful. I mean, we've had a few speakers, haven't we? And I have to say, they kind of start to all sort of sound quite similar, and you start to wonder whether it's actually making any difference. But this certainly made me sit up in my seat, and that kind of what's that phrase about decolonizing history? I was thinking how I studied history at GCSE and A level, and slavery barely got a mention, and all of that, and got so much a kind of colonized version of history, and that seems so important to throw that out, and I hope that's changing in our education system. But the kind of really visceral imagery was incredibly powerful. I'm sure really hard for some people to hear, but felt really necessary and kind of absolutely made me feel kind of understanding where we are today from the absolutely hideous history that has led to it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Shabs, you're on mute. You're on mute, Shabs.
Thank you, Kim. It's me talking. I was saying the chat was on fire. Basically, there's lots in the chat, Abu-Bakr. So I hope you will read the chat later. But we have some hands up. Jamie, can you see whose hand is up?
Hang on. If you just joined, can you go on mute?
Can you go on mute? Yes, please.
Kath has her hand up. Kath.
Brilliant, Kath. Come on in, Kath.
Yeah. So first, thank you very much. And I suppose before I ask my question, I have got, I suppose, a comment, which is, I mean, I think it's upsetting for all of us, but especially for Black colleagues. I wonder if we need to think about having a bit of time after we have some of these sessions so that people don't go straight back to work. Because I can imagine that it's kind of devastating, even But I suppose my question is about next steps and what you think, for an organisation like ours, where I think we are probably a bit like the Guinness, and obviously we do have systemic problems, as you would in any organisation in the UK, about what you think might be ways that we start working through that.
I think the first thing which I usually say to companies is them to have awareness. They need to realize no company is perfect. There are deficiencies or defects, and how we're going to amend that. And it's always good to talk to the staff in confidentiality, making sure that they're not going to be put out and exposed as not being a team player. This has to stop now, you know, because sometimes people are becoming team players and it's against them. And it is actually increasing, you know, mental health issues, you know, like stress, anxiety, elements of depression, because they're not really believing in what they're supposed to do. And I think the measure that needs to be taken is that whatever policies that, you know, companies have, it shouldn't just be in print. It needs to go through its implementation and application within that industry. And that has been the problem since, you know, Equal Opportunities Act, which was passed in 1975, Racial Relation Act in 1976, Disability Act in 1995, and all these other type of things. And the reality is, with all these acts are passing and passed, reports is done, and a lot of these things are staying reports. When is the implementation application for change and diversity and flexibility amongst the workforce is going to occur? Because this open window which we have now, like I said, we always have these little open windows. It looks like it's every 20 years that race issue is only allowed to be discussed, and then let's move on to something else. And a lot of the reports that show the systemic or structural racial practices within organizations is just in paper, you know, and they're not doing anything to try to increase the implementation and application among staff members, especially senior management teams. This is what is the problem. So that's what needs to be done. Take it from the print, put it into practice, yeah, and make it livable. In Jamaica, we got this concept, livity. That document should live the reality. It shouldn't just sound good on paper, but it's not implemented in practice. Livity is the way forward. Okay, live in the reality of that document. So I hope I've answered your question, and I hope I've clarified some of the steps that organizations, companies can go to try to overturn the system. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Abu-Bakr. I can't see whose hand is up. Jamie,
Shari's hand.
Shari, lovely, Shari, come on in.
Hi, it's not really a question. Well, it's not a question at all. It really is just to say thank you. That's probably one of the most educational webinars I've ever sat through.
Okay.
And I wish I sat through this, and so many times I thought, I wish you were one of my teachers at school. And I can only hope that my son, when he goes to school, I'm a mother of a mixed race boy, I can only hope that somebody like you is in the classroom. Yeah. I really do hope that happens.
Yeah.
This has been so insightful.
Good. Thank you very much for that. I really appreciate
Shari is notoriously hard to please, so that's a very high praise indeed.
I will say nothing and put myself back on mute, Jamie.
Anybody else with their hand up, Jamie?
Becca Dove is
Becca. Hey, Becca.
Hello. So firstly, I just wanted to say hi to my lovely friends Abu-Bakr and Maimouna, and I hope you're well. And I also just wanted to say to Abu-Bakr and to Maimouna, you guys came along and you gave this same talk to colleagues in children's services and family support some months ago, and I have to tell you that it is still talked about to this day. It's influenced thinking, it's opened up spaces for conversation, for change. Yeah. I could list off the number of changes that have happened as a result of you doing that, but I wanted you to know that you've made a sizable difference in Camden already, and the journey continues. So yeah, forever grateful to you, my friends.
Thank you very much, Becca, for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Becca. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Becca. I just wanted to say Maimouna didn't present today, Becca, and Abu-Bakr did a slightly different version, actually. He prepared this especially for us here in adults. But Maimouna didn't present today. Maimouna will definitely be one of our speakers to follow. Maimouna, did you want to unmute your mic and say hello today? I don't want to put you on the spot.
Yeah, hello. No, that's absolutely fine. Thank you so much. I was just listening away as ever. I'm also from Wales, in Cardiff, like Abu-Bakr, and it's just amazing to hear him all the time. And honestly, you know, it's sad to say that it's nothing new that I'm hearing all the time. But yeah, honestly, it's just, and as Shari was saying, it's a part of education. Like, we should be teaching this to our children from nursery age. And so, yeah, it's just about re-educating people and like constantly educating yourself. So it's just refreshing to see that, you know, I guess it's better late than never, but it is amazing that we're doing this. But I'm always pessimistic in terms of, you know, the tick boxes. I've always got them lingering away somewhere, you know, but it is still good that we're continuing this conversation, and it wasn't just a June thing when George Floyd sadly, you know, got murdered. So it's amazing that it's continuing and we're in February. So yeah, thank you so much, Abu-Bakr and Shabnam, and hi Becca, I hope you're well.
Maimouna, thank you so much. I mean, if you want, Maimouna will be back and share a session with us. But Maimouna runs every Thursday. She has a webinar on and it's called the Privilege Cafe, isn't it, Maimouna? Did you want to say a little bit about that? And Abu-Bakr comes there, and I attend, and it's the best space. You know, I mean, it's such a brave space. So Maimouna, did you want to say a little bit about that, because people here, I'm sure, would want to join?
Yeah, so basically, I literally started as we got into the first lockdown in April, and it's just a virtual space to discuss basically issues around privilege and race, anything underpinned by those issues. And yeah, initially, I guess I just thought it was literally just a Zoom on a Thursday, bringing people together. I'm very much a people's person, you know, discussing these topics I would be doing in the real world, but I just wanted to bring this online because of COVID and amazing topics. You know, Abu-Bakr has been coming since I started, really amazing topics, unconscious bias, discrimination. It is really just an open, free space, and it's just grown and grown and grown, I guess, from there. And you know, the amount of speakers I've had and the expertise and knowledge that I've had shared, I guess it is more than just a Zoom every Thursday now. But the impact it's having, it's definitely blown me away, and it is amazing. But yeah, everyone's welcome. Thursdays 5:30 on Zoom, basically. Yeah.
Thank
Sorry
you. I
about the
can share
music in
those
the background.
details.
It's so loud.
I can share those details with everyone.
Thank you.
Kim,
Thank you so much.
Kim Christodoulou had her hand up.
Yes, hi. Again, yeah, just thank you so much for that absolutely inspiring presentation, and just really sort of opened, you know, the depths of my thoughts and feelings about what I heard today. And a lot of people will know just a little bit about me, but I grew up in South Africa in a white family.
Yeah.
And my mother and father had some very brave people in their lives who sort of taught them about what was happening in terms of discrimination. And as a result, I was put into a school that was one of the only multiracial schools in all of the country.
Okay.
And so I grew up as a white child, one of the only white children in South Africa to be with where my classmates were mixed race and black children. And I learned about what was happening. I saw what was happening, and I saw it from the eyes of my colleagues, my black colleagues who were next to me, and we visited each other, and we found ways to see each other and to be with each other, because we were so segregated in that country.
Yes.
And that's what inspired me to become a social worker. And I've told this to many people, that the sense of social justice and the sense of social responsibility that I felt growing up and seeing that is what led me to become a social worker, to do the job that I do today. And I suppose one of the things that I sort of think about a lot is that I often, even now, as you say, you know, in the place that I grew up, it was so stark, and it was so obvious what was happening. But sometimes in today's society, it's not spoken about. And there's often these micro racisms and these micro discriminations that happen just here, there, every day.
Yes.
And just how we sort of call those things out, and how we find the empathy and find the way to connect, so that, you know, I mean, most people in the caring professions, we've come here because we care about people, and we want to fight against these, the inequalities, the discriminations, the prejudice, and just how we sort of bring that not just at a structural level, but at an interpersonal level, in the work that we do. So yeah, I suppose there's not many, there's no easy answers. But I suppose sessions like today just give voice and give rise to thinking and being able to open the conversation and to learn, because I was one of those children who could have grown up with my head in the sand, but brave people around me brought me on a journey to something completely different. So the change can happen, and it can be there.
Yes. Well, thanks for that anyway, and that's been enlightening. And one of the things, because like I said, with my presentation, I try to make it as global as possible, because I know many of us come from different cultural groups, etc. And one of the things I didn't want to do, which is usually the case, is that when we look at like racism, discrimination, and prejudice that takes place within this country, we make it look like it's just a Western problem. No, it's a global problem. That's the thing, it's a global problem. And there are people out there from other countries who are trying their best to try to see its elimination or eradication with very little success, but those people do exist. And that's one thing that I'm glad you mentioned, about your personal experience, that yours was the exception to the rule, what was taking place in South Africa under the apartheid regime, which was a horrific system, etc. And it's just nice to know that someone like yourself was on this forum to enlighten us, people like myself and your work colleagues, that did exist during that particular time. So thank you very much.
Any other hands up, Jamie?
Can't see.
Anybody would anybody
hands.
Okay. Anybody like to share anything? Abu-Bakr, is there still got a little bit of time? Is there anything you wanted to end with? Oh, Sandra's got her hand up. 1 minute, Abu-Bakr. Okay, Sandra, come on in.
Hi, Abu-Bakr. Thank you so much for that. That was really, really insightful. Good. And basically, you took us to school. So thank you for taking us to school. I'm American, as you can see. So I understand a lot of the references that you made, but also have experienced quite overt racism, kind of in your face racism, but also have experienced racism here, which is slightly different. You kind of walk away thinking, oh God, did she really say that? Or did he really say that? And you kind of have to double guess. And then you come back and you're like, no, that was definitely racist. And it's that kind of difference that you notice between here and America. This is just my own opinion, obviously, and what things that I have experienced myself. I guess another thing that I want to mention is that I have been collating people's stories since the beginning of George Floyd, and I've got like a document of people's stories of what they've experienced in the workplace. And also I've collected stories about what happens to people outside of the workplace. And so I guess my question to you is, and this is what I say to a lot of people, if I am experiencing all of this stuff as soon as I leave my house as a Black woman, I then have to come into work and experience again, microaggressions, overt racism experiences at work. Where is the safe space for me? And how are we making sure that we are creating safe spaces? I mean, we do have safe spaces in Camden, which I have helped to create. But I think you kind of have to ask about psychological safety. And I guess it's making sure people are aware that it's not a safe space for everybody. And I say to people, always start thinking that, because what I heard from lots of our white colleagues is that, oh no, we're all having the same experiences. No, we're not. And I think the best thing to do is always think that this is not a safe space for me. So if you start from that point, then we're all on an even playing field. But if you just assume that this is a safe space for me, we're not, because it's not always a safe space for me.
Yes. I understand. Yeah, and this is something else, you know, and I think this is something we need to take into consideration, is looking at the type of social spaces that are occupied and what type of energy is dispersed within those spaces. Are the people being feel welcomed or not? You know, are they allowed to express the reality of their situation or their condition?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not going to be pushed to one side or denied or attacked, etc. And you are right, more social spaces need to be acknowledged. And I do know that, you know, it is increasing. People like yourself have developed those, and this is what's important. Those of you who are in those positions of privilege or power, which can actually make that difference and make those changes, utilize that force within you to make those changes for someone else or for the next generation, because it really starts with you, you know, and anyone can do it, you know, and that's what it's about. Please use that power and privilege you have to make those changes, because many of you can get away with things that the average other person may not be able to do. But while you're in that position, please utilize that to make someone's life much more happier and much more fruitful. So they want to come to work. They want to work with you, and reach out to those people who you may not know nothing about. Most times you ask some of the stupidest questions are the best questions, because hundreds and thousands of people's got that on their mind, but they won't discuss it. And sometimes a person from another community will enlighten you about that, because they want you to interact with them. Ask me about me, my culture, what I do, what I feel, what I think, you know? And I think that's what the dominant culture needs to realize, you know? We do have that emotional open space within ourselves that we're looking to receive the dominant culture, for us to take them on that little journey that we have gone through as an individual, or as a group of people, or as a family, of what we've confronted in this country. And we still have belief, and that's the thing with people who are victims of racism, we still have a strong belief that change will come. And that's amazing. We haven't given up. Even though we're going through that, we still have that hope it's going to change, you know?
Yeah.
That's a positive thing. So yeah.
That's all we got, Abu-Bakr. That's all we got.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Abu-Bakr. I think someone else had their hand up, but I can't see the name. And I think Jamie had to go to another meeting. Oh, yes, you're still here, Jamie. Ilirette. Ilirette, come on in.
Hello, good afternoon. I just want to say thank you so much, Abu-Bakr. A lot of what you said really resonated with me. I picked up that you have a Caribbean background, and some of the information you shared, I can recall my parents talking about a lot of those things, but even more than that, it's the connections that you're making. I believe what you discussed today is relevant for everyone, no matter what background that we come from. And I do really believe all we got is hope. And yes, I just want to say thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you very much, Ta.
Thank you.
I had one last question, actually, which would be, as someone who really liked history, and I'm currently listening to a podcast about the Haitian Revolution and the kind of pivotal role that played in, you know, ultimately sort of leading to that kind of global ending of slavery. And it's an amazing, amazing story, which I don't think is that well known. But yeah, any wider reading that you would recommend, I would, you know, eat it up.
Yeah, the history of the Haitian Revolution is important. It was the first independent state in the Western world, and it was the first time that women, it happened to be black women in this case, voted in 1804. They chose their political leader. White women didn't get the vote until the 1920s in America and in Britain. So there was things that slaves did, you know, when they got their freedom, in order to embrace the so-called philosophy of democracy. So, you know, The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James. If you read that book, that's lovely and concise about the Haitian Revolution. That's brilliant. There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack by Paul Gilroy. That's another good book that focuses on the 1960s to the 1980s. You know, so it looks at like the race riots, and it looks at Thatcherism and unemployment and all those other type of things. Other books, which is pretty good, which coming out of America, White Fragility, you know, which is a good book. That is a very good book, you know. Other books like, I got so much books here, Sex and Race This is 3 volumes. It's written by a Jamaican. This looks at the history of mixed race people through the ages. So people who got mixed race children, etc. This is a good book, and it looks at race relations over time from antiquity all the way to contemporary. Contemporary being the 1940s, because that's when obviously this book was published. This book here, Nature Knows No Color Line, by the same author, Joel Rogers, is another good book that looks at the history of race relations in antiquity, you know, under particular high cultures and civilizations. New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander is good, looking at the penal system in America and the prison industrial complex and how that feeds into wealth making within the United States of America. Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Joy DeGruy is another good book, looking at the intergenerational trauma that slavery has brought and how that affected dark-skinned people. I can go on loads with different books, but I've thrown a few out there: sociological, historical, psychological, to give you a little bit of flavor, because I come from all those backgrounds.
Jamie, you got a book list there. There you go, and everyone else as well. Oh my, oh my, oh my. I mean, if we were all in the room, I think we would stand up and give you a standing ovation, Abu-Bakr. I mean, thank you so much. You know, the question I asked you was, you know, how many hats do you wear and how do they all connect? And you beautifully, through, you know, it was just all throughout your presentation, you brought that alive for us through religion, through culture, through, you know, every history, through philosophy, and it was absolutely, you know, a journey. You know, as Sandra said, you took us back to school. Brilliant. And we can only hope that our children would have, you know, teachers like you. You'll have to come back to Camden. I'm sure I'm going to, you know, get so many requests for you to come back. And as our webinar progresses, we'll definitely ask you to come back, and you and I can have a conversation of how we're traveling in Camden, and then bring you back to do something around that for us. The other thing I wanted to say is thank everybody here for coming. We had about 92 people at one time, so that's amazing.
Over 100.
Over 100. Okay, amazing. And that shows to me that in Camden, you know, we're committed to this. You know, we want to learn, we want to grow, we want to change. And you know, as we go along, I mean, one point was brought up, and I was going to bring this up with my director anyway, about safe spaces. I know Sandra, the American lady who was speaking, runs something in children's, but I don't think we definitely don't have anything in adults. So we definitely need to work on that and think about safe spaces for people, because there was a lot of truths you shared today, which was so painful. You know, so for lots of people, for everyone, but particularly for Black people, to hear Black is ugly, it's really uncomfortable, you know, and it's painful. So so lots of reflections, lots of discussions, and we will continue these conversations. I was thinking, Jamie, in one of our heads meeting, we should use this webinar as a discussion point. I don't know who's next or in view. Well,
I'll certainly share the recording with my
with everyone that
SMT colleagues. Really.
But maybe have it as an open house. That's what I meant. I was looking for
an open
house. To share our reflections, because I'm sure people would want to say a lot more. But Abu-Bakr, you know, we're so grateful. And lots of people have had to go, but please read the chat afterwards, Abu-Bakr, and I'll send you the recording. And thank you from the bottom of our hearts. We really appreciate you, and thank you for all that you're doing. You know,
thank you. We all love you. Come on, everybody. Thank you.
And thank you everyone for coming. I hope you take some time. Everyone's still clapping.
The first round of applause I've had.
Amazing.
Lockdown, so well done.
Everybody get a drink, take 5 minutes, have a breath and pause, and take care of yourselves. I'm contactable. Contact me later or during the week, and give me feedback and share your thoughts. Take care, everybody. I'll stay on here if anybody wants to say anything, or I'll just stay on till the end and say bye-bye to you all.
I'd like to lie down and enter a data meeting instead. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie, for co-hosting.
Bye. Thanks.
Hi, Shabnam.
Yes.
I missed the session because I was in another meeting. Where will the recording be available?
So I'll share it with you. I'll figure out how to do all of that. Don't worry. Because we've recorded it. Yeah.
Okay.
And then we'll share
Yes.
it with everyone.
Yeah, because it sounds like it was a great session.
It absolutely was. Without a doubt, it was. So I'll absolutely. Yeah, we've recorded it.
Thank you. I look forward to receiving them.
Brilliant, Pamela. Thank you for coming. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
No worries. Maimouna, great. Thank you for coming, Maimouna. I know it was a very
Thank you
last
so
minute
much.
invitation, but I know you always,
No worries.
love to hear Abu-Bakr speak.
Yeah, of course,
Who doesn't?
definitely, every time. Exactly. Thank you. Abu-Bakr, great. Thank you so much.
Thank
No worries,
you.
Maimouna. See you on
Take
Thursday at the
care.
cafe. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Thank
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye. Thanks again.
No worries. Thank you so much for coming.
Mm.
So lots of comments, Abu-Bakr.
Yes, yes. I'm going to try and read through some of them.
Yes, yeah. There was one comment she had to leave from Janelle. She was saying, it's hard for Black Africans and Diaspora to even study their history because so much was destroyed, including removing our indigenous names to separate us from our history.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah,
yeah. I'm just looking. I took photos of some. And then there was quite a lot of chat around the mental disorder. So people were saying, I do feel like there's a risk calling racism a mental disorder, as it gives people an excuse. A mental disorder almost rids them of accountability.
Yeah.
It was so interesting. Yes.
It's Becca. You're still recording, love. Do you want to stop
Yeah, Becca.
the
How do we stop recording, Becca? Oh, join us, Becca. How do I don't actually know how to stop the recording. Let me have a look. Do you know? More actions.
Yes. So if you go to your three ellipses,
yes,
there should be. In fact, I can do it for you.
Yes,
stop recording.
Yes, lovely, Becca.